Hello everyone, and welcome to this very special evening. My name is Aimee Shaalan, and as Director of McCann, an organization that works to provide transformational education to strengthen the movement for Palestinian liberation, I'm really honored to have been invited by the Palestine Festival of Literature and Fitzcarraldo Editions to be your host tonight. In many ways, the book and the writer at the center of this event needs no introduction. Wadie Said was one of the most famous intellectuals of the 20th century, and his work shapes the ways we think about literature, culture, and power today. We continue to use, engage, and critique the tools and frameworks that he offered us, from Orientalism and the relationship between culture and imperialism to his unflinching analyses of the post-colonial political order in the Arab region. His influence in the global north, as well as Arab and other recently decolonized regions, or mostly decolonized regions, remains profound. After authoring dozens of books and hundreds of articles in the world's leading English and Arabic newspapers and journals, decades of teaching and years of political work for Palestinian liberation, Said died of cancer during the Second Intifada in 2003. It was just a few months after the American invasion of Iraq. And in the cataclysm that followed, so many felt the absence of his voice and his analysis. We could guess what he would say, but we mourned having him around to say it. We gather tonight, more than 20 years after his passing, and more than 1 year into Israel's genocidal assault against Palestinians in Gaza, a violence that has now spread with alarming speed and scale to Lebanon. The world's biggest and most powerful liberal democracies, including the one in which we sit tonight, have not only permitted, but actively enabled the atrocities that are being carried out. With their weapons and military capabilities, their official political support, and their media industries. We who are not in power may feel devastated, but we cannot allow ourselves to be paralyzed by the scale of the devastation, which is devastating. More than 44,700 Palestinians killed and thousands more missing. At least 1.9 million displaced in Gaza and over 1 million displaced in Lebanon. Thousands of children without parents. Thousands of amputees who may or may not survive. The targeting of hospitals, schools, universities, cultural centers, places of worship, of ancient Arab cities and their infrastructures of life. Facing a nuclear power backed by the world's most powerful, and to quote the failed US Democratic nominee, most lethal militaries in the world, the asymmetry of what continues to be described in the news as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or worse still, the Israel-Hamas war, is staggering. But Said teaches us that imperial power is backed up and part constituted by the ideas, analyses, media, and a language that allows it to continue its violence. Said's work makes it impossible to pretend that the word and the idea, the writer and the teacher and the artist do not matter, even in the face of 2,000-ton bombs and robot drones. Language and knowledge and culture are a core part of our ability to resist oppression, colonialism, and annihilation, and Palestinians have always known this. We must take honest stock of where we are in these darkest of days for Palestine, for the region that sits at the heart of it, and for humanity. We have also seen a continuing mobilization of support for Palestine on a truly global scale. Millions of people have said no. We have seen solidarity being both expressed and practiced. Dock workers in India, Greece, Italy, South Africa, and the United States have refused to load ships with weapons headed for Israel. At least 11 countries have severed diplomatic relations with Israel. And last spring, university students in the United States launched the largest student mobilization this century, triggering outrageously violent reactions from their administrations, which continue to this day. Around the world, writers, scholars, and artists have used their craft to speak against the ongoing genocide, apartheid, and occupation of Palestinian land. They have also organized themselves into positions of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israeli institutions that are complicit. Facing smear campaigns, jail cells, professional losses, and worse, people have insisted on truth and justice. But more than this, there has been a true reawakening, a renewed recognition of the imperialism at the heart of what produces the crises of the world, from the ongoing Nakba in Palestine to the crises of ecology and the return of fascistic power in supposedly liberal democracies. So who better to have with us but Said, one of the most prolific writers on colonialism and imperialism, on their representations and ideas, and one of the most articulate advocates of the Palestinian anti-colonial cause in the English-speaking world. As we try to steady and sustain ourselves against a horror that is accelerating, what a gift it is to have this republication of Said's The Question of Palestine, more than 45 years since it was originally published. A critical reminder that the legacy, clarity, and contribution of his intellect has not been lost, but lives on. So tonight, we will hear from 8 thinkers and writers from Gaza, Nazareth, Lebanon, Iraq, Cairo, and the UK on the question of Palestine today. On behalf of Fitzcarraldo Editions and the Palestine Festival of Literature, I would like to thank the Southbank Centre for being partners to this event. Thank you to their team who have helped us set everything up, to the people working on the projections, closed captioning, the audio and video, the ushers and the booksellers outside. And thank all of you for coming. So we're going to start now with a short video. But first of all, I'd just like to say welcome to our speakers also on the stage.
I mean, I could say this almost without qualification, right from the moment I arrived in the West in the early 50s until the present. Initially, there's always a sense in which, as an Arab and obviously as a Palestinian, you feel in some way criminalized or delinquent. So powerful is the definition of you as somebody who's outside the pale, I mean, whose sole sort of purpose in life is to kill Jews. The overall feeling that I have is one, when I think about it, for any length of time, is one of astonishment that at the sort of injustice of it. Here I am, a child of a people that's been sort of kicked out of its own land, forbidden to return. I mean, that is to say, most of the authors of these books, for example, are sometimes students who are employed by these agencies to spy on me and to find out what I say and this sort of thing. And if they're Jewish, just by fact of being Jewish, born in New York, of a Jewish parent, they're entitled to go to Israel, or Palestine as I call it, become Israeli citizens at any time that they wish. I was born there, my father was born there, my grandfather, great-grand, etc. And I can't return. I don't have the same right. I mean, the law of return somehow covers them. And my people, my family, were kicked out of there. And they're writing books about me, accusing me of terrorism. I mean, the enormity of the whole thing just baffles me at the same time that it strikes me very strongly. The great problem that we face as a people is that we're being told by the Israelis that, in a certain sense, we don't really exist, that the continuity of our existence in Palestine, that our history, our identity, is sort of manageable by Israeli historians, by propagandists, by politicians, is manageable as something else. The Arabs of Judea and Samaria, Begin used to call us, two-legged beasts, terrorists, everything but not Palestinians. We were there. I mean, you can't do more than that. But it's so indecent and humiliating an exercise to have to say that we do exist. That is to say, there were villages, Palestinian villages, there were Palestinian cities, there was a Palestinian society, there were Palestinian people before 1948 who were Arab and who formed a society, underdeveloped or whatever you want to call it, but it was there, which abruptly and dramatically in the middle part of 1948 was shattered, dismantled, destroyed by the Zionists. When you read a brilliantly elegant and ironic novel by Jane Austen, do you think of colonial slavery? Or when you read a brooding existential narrative by Albert Camus, do you think of the atrocities of the Algerian War of Independence? Or when you watch images of the Gulf War and see the technological superiority of the American Army and Air Force, do you think of the European Orientalists? I think you should. The great works of modern Western culture do not transcend the fact of empire. In fact, European culture shaped the imperial dynamic, but few people think of it that way. Show me the Zulu Tolstoy. What about the Bantu Proust? Was there ever a Haitian or Jamaican Mozart? The arrogance, the contempt in these statements runs through the language of people who claim to be speaking for the West and for what the West did. So, as Frantz Fanon says, when a native hears a speech about Western culture, he pulls out his knife, or at least he makes sure that it is within reach. The West, the East, the Orient, the Occident, the European mind, the African mind, the Asian spirit, the Japanese mind, Islam, Christianity. There's some truth to those labels, but most of them are ideological fictions. They're constructs. They're fictional identities. They are the weapons of cultural war.
And finally, and to me most important, there never was the realization that some of us had that, how shall I put it? There was a fundamental irreconcilable between Israelis or the Zionist movement and Palestinians. It wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about living in the past. It wasn't about all this other stuff. It really was about land. And unless you devise a category by which land is not exclusively owned, there's no hope. And what the Israelis were doing, and have done since the beginning, since the end of the 19th century until now, as the Zionist movement, was to take more and more land, and Palestinians have lost more and more land. And there's no way of reconciling between these two sort of opposing movements. One losing and dispossessing, and the other one, losing land and being dispossessed, and the other one taking more. And that's where I came to the conclusion that the only sensible resolution, given the obstinacy and the obduracy of the Israelis, who had so much power thanks to the United States, that they could afford to ignore the facts and reality, was to think about a way in which they could live together as equals, not on a partitioned land, but as equals on a land called Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, depending on, in which people were equal and not defined by their ethnos or by their religion. But this is very difficult for, above all, American Jews. I think many Israelis would accept that. But American Jews, I think, are the main obstacle in this, because for them, Israel is a kind of secular religion, and it has to be a place to which they can retire or return or retreat or whatever. And they resist this idea. But there's no other way you can deal with the Palestinians as an actuality without thinking in terms of equality. I believed for a long time in the proposition that you could partition the land again, as the British tried to do in 1947 and 48. But partition brings more problems, as we know from India and Pakistan, we know from Ireland, we know from Cyprus, that if you keep partitioning the land, you either propagate and continue the conflict, or you resolve nothing, as the case was in Lebanon. They fought the civil war, 150,000 people were killed, and they're back to where they started from.
What you're talking about is a utopian idea.
Yeah, it is utopian. Yeah, it is. But, I mean, look at the alternative. The alternative has been bloodletting on a scale that no one can afford. I mean, the Israelis think they can afford it, but, I think they're banking too heavily on unlimited United States munificence. Who knows with these people in the White House and people afterwards? They're counting on the fact that Palestinians in the end will give up. They're not going to give up. I mean, that seems to be as absolutely clear to me as. And there's not even a formula for them to give up. All that's being offered them is that they negate themselves. I mean, that's not. So I think the alternative is much, much worse than the so-called utopian, vision, or at least the utopian proposition. But I think, on the other hand, that if one could multiply these kinds of efforts, such as mine, I think the chances of success are far greater than people suspect, but that's all that's before us. There aren't too many other offerings on the plate.
His words sit deep, and the Palestinians are not going to give up. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for the night, Saree Makdisi. He's a literary critic, a professor at UCLA, and a host, along with his brothers Kareem and Osama of Makdisi Street podcast. Saree is the author of several books, including the groundbreaking William Blake and the Impossible History of the 1790s, and Romantic Imperialism, Universal Empire and the Culture of Modernity. Much of his writing moves seamlessly between literary criticism and decolonial analysis, much like the work of Edward Said, his uncle. Saree is the author of the preface to the new edition of The Question of Palestine that's brought us all together tonight. So please join me in welcoming Saree.
Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for joining us in this celebration of this remarkable book. Any discussion, it seems to me, of the question of Palestine must begin with a reflection on the calamity that the Zionist state is inflicting on the Palestinian people right now, above all in Gaza. Over the past year, attempts to convey this terrifying harm have shifted from absolute to relative numbers, an accumulation of records set, broken, and set again, all in the space of a few months. A grim statistical compendium of relative death and destruction that seems, the larger it grows, to make absolute death and destruction all the more impossible to truly comprehend. For raw numbers alone are hardly sufficient to convey the meaning, which is to say the human experience of the destruction that is being carefully, methodically, deliberately imposed by Israel on people for whose welfare it is legally accountable as the power that has unilaterally chosen to impose on them a military occupation since June 1967. And in any case, Palestinians are not just a legion of broken and mangled bodies. They are not just numbers, although we keep coming back to the numbers. They are sentient and inventive human beings who, through all these decades of brutal military occupation and the bitterness of exile, constitute a proud and still steadfast people with a distinct history, literature, art, music, cuisine, and Arabic dialect of their own. They are a people who put care into the making of their homes, people who take pride in their accomplishments at work, people who studied hard to attain and maintain a literacy rate higher than that of Israel itself, people who tend their ancestral olive groves with love, who have made contributions to science and medicine, who have produced some of the most brilliant and influential writers of the modern era, including, of course, Edward Said himself. People who take joy at the sight of their laughing children and who weep together in times of pain. People who think of the past, deal with the present, and plan for the future. People who work, people who raise their children and care for their parents. People who dream, people who laugh and cry, people who read, write, cook, mend, plant, build. People with lives, loves, cares, thoughts, sorrows, anxieties, pains, desires, passions, worries. And people with inalienable rights, including the right not to live or to die like this. The next time you read the headline, "Dozens Die in Gaza Airstrikes," try to remember that misleading and mystifying phrase, carefully designed by anonymous newspaper editors to veil agency and responsibility and to draw readers into the shadowy realm of obscurity and abstraction, is covering up far more than it claims to cover as news, a distinction that Edward Said drew in Covering Islam, the sister volume to the Question of Palestine. Those dozens, scores, or hundreds carelessly being swept away by Israel's American-supplied bombs are living and thinking and feeling and suffering human beings, members of a close-knit community whose homes are being smashed, whose children are being dismembered, whose meager possessions are being ground to dust, whose lives are being snuffed out for no other reason than the fact that they are Palestinian and that they continue to exist. Dehumanization in media and in representation accompanies and makes possible Israel's attempt to dehumanize Palestinians materially. That, of course, is one of the great lessons of Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. As for whom Israel kills on any given day, either in Gaza or now in Lebanon as well, that is entirely random. Today, it's this group of homes or tents that are bombed. Tomorrow, it's those. Today, Israel kills these families. Tomorrow, it's those families. Today, it's these children's turn to be killed or dismembered by Israel. Tomorrow, it's those. Today, Israel kills 86 people. Tomorrow, it'll kill 97. The day after, the number could be 55 or 38 or 107. Today, it's this family's turn to mourn. Tomorrow, it's another family's turn. Today, this is the man, his name is Muhammad, who must scoop up the remnants of his children into plastic bags and assert to the camera, how many times have we seen this? These are my children. Summoning the humanity of his dead children through the invocation of a bodily integrity that literally no longer exists. Tomorrow, it'll be Ahmad's turn, or Hiba's, or Jamila's, or Yusuf's. It's all entirely up to chance and to the moods and whims of Israeli pilots and artillery crews and the humming computers and targeting officers lazily chewing gum in Tel Aviv. Amid all this randomness, the only constant is the killing itself. Actually, there's one other constant, which is the massive and unprecedented destruction that Israel is meting out, sweeping away not just individual homes, but entire communities with the push of a single button. Life is more important than property, and concrete doesn't scream with pain when it is broken. So in the face of the human calamity to which we're all bearing witness, we rarely pause to give those shattered buildings and neighborhoods much thought compared to the families and children whose lives are being swept away. But all those now hollowed out squares of ruin were once living homes where families raised their children, where people cooked and played and read and wrote and drew and talked and laughed and cried, where busy mothers could once take a few minutes out of their hectic days to brew a bittersweet Arabic coffee laced Gaza style with cardamom, to sip on balconies in the spring sunshine of days that no longer exist. Written 45 years ago, the question of Palestine still helps us to think through and to comprehend, if not to accept, what is happening in Gaza, elsewhere in Palestine, and now, of course, in Lebanon as well. As the book shows, the Palestinian struggle is above all about representation. It is simultaneously a movement for the Palestinian people's right to political self-representation and for their right to represent themselves, to humanize themselves in their own narratives. Decades of colonial rule followed by enforced exile, military occupation, apartheid, and genocide have denied and continue to deny the Palestinian people's right to self-representation. And for almost as long, their right to represent themselves in their own voice, to tell their own story, has also been denied by a combination of repression or simple refusal to acknowledge and listen. One reason the question of Palestine is so important, in fact, is that its appearance in print marked the first time an authoritative Palestinian voice, writing in equally authoritative English, found its way to a widespread Western audience. Many other Palestinian narratives in English have appeared since then, but this is the book that paved the way. Rereading the book 45 years after its first publication, it's difficult not to notice the extent to which some things simply haven't changed at all, an impression reinforced by the videos we just saw. To criticize Zionism, Said writes in the book, is to criticize a wall of denial. That is surely as true in 2024 as it was when he was writing in 1979. So is the same tedious Zionist refusal to acknowledge the history out of which the Zionist project emerged and the catastrophic harm that it has caused and continues to cause. Then, as now, the main recourse of Israel's defenders in the West, in the face of the demand for historical reckoning and justice, is the turn to shrill accusations of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Some things, to be sure, are even worse today than as described in the book. Said points out that no sizable, and I'm quoting here, no sizable segment of the Israeli population has as yet been able to confront the terrible social and political injustice done to the native Palestinians in 1948. The overriding Israeli attitude towards the Palestinians has, if anything, hardened over the years, from that stubborn refusal to acknowledge and redress the wrongs of the Nakba, or catastrophe of 1948, to outright calls for those wrongs to be extended and taken to their logical conclusion. The first Israeli acknowledgement of the Nakba of 1948, ironically, came in the imperative for the Nakba to be continued to the end 75 years later. On the other hand, there's also been a vast improvement in certain areas since the book first appeared. The Zionist position in the United States and Europe, which was at the very peak of its power and influence when Said wrote the book, is now on the defensive, if not in terminal decline. When Said wrote the book, Zionism was affiliated with progressive and liberal politics. Its last remaining bedfellows in the West today come from the far right, including openly anti-Semitic white nationalists. For all its remaining menace, institutional Zionism in the United States and Europe operates on the back foot. Its last resort, the desperate tactics of intimidation, censorship, repression, blacklisting, and the suffocation of intellectual and academic freedom and the right to protest that Americans, like Europeans, take for granted. Once a value around which people could build a positive political orientation, Zionism today operates strictly in the domain of negative energy. Meanwhile, the Palestinian position is not only more widely acknowledged and appreciated in the West than it was in 1979, there is considerable support for it as well. The university students who erected Palestine solidarity encampments across the world in the spring of 2024 represented the conscience of their generations and of their communities. And many social movements in the US and Europe today recognize that, in the words of my colleague, the historian Robin Kelly, Palestine is the ground zero of a liberated world. The question of Palestine helped to make that recognition possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Saree, and for that very important reminder of the things that have changed since the book was first published. Our next speaker, Jehad Abusalim, was, I'm very sorry to say, not granted a visa to the UK in time to travel from the US, where he lives, for tonight's event. Jehad is from Deir al-Balah in Gaza, and he's the co-editor, alongside the late Rifat al-Arir, of the brilliant anthology Light in Gaza. He's the executive director of the Institute of Palestine Studies in the United States, and while we're sorry that he can't be here tonight, he did very kindly record some words for us earlier, which we're going to watch now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm grateful to the Palestine Festival of Literature for inviting me to speak tonight alongside an incredible lineup of speakers. It's an honor to share these pre-recorded words, knowing and hoping they will resonate with you. It's unfortunate that I couldn't join you in person simply because my visa wasn't issued, which prevented me from traveling to the UK. Still, it's a privilege to mark the republication of Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. Edward Said was a true intellectual, someone who deeply understood the role of writing in society, especially its power to shape and reshape the world we live in. Whether in Orientalism, culture and imperialism, The Question of Palestine, or his writings on the so-called peace process and the Oslo era, Said didn't try to show off intellectual mastery or perfect his use of language. He wrote to challenge systems of power, those that bent knowledge, scholarship, and understanding to justify hegemony, control, and domination. Said knew that language, representation, and framing weren't just abstract ideas or expressions on paper. He saw them as tools with real-world consequences for people's lives and fates. With his pen, he pushed back against those systems of knowledge and representation, challenging what was normalized in academic and public discourse. The Question of Palestine is a critical part, if not one of the most important parts of that effort. Today, Palestinians aren't just confined by Israel's walls, fences, and checkpoints. Our history, narratives, and stories are obscured through deliberate efforts to silence us. There is an orchestrated campaign to erase Palestinian voices and experiences. Nowhere is this clearer than in Gaza, where we are witnessing one of the bloodiest campaigns of genocide of the century. A nuclear power is not only engaged in the mass killing of civilians and the annihilation of entire cities, towns, and communities, but also in the systematic destruction of schools, universities, archives, heritage sites, archaeological sites, ancient churches, mosques, theaters, and civil society institutions. In Gaza, Israel has killed hundreds of academics, educators, authors, and artists. It is dismantling the foundations of society, of human existence itself. The violence is so extreme that the line between metaphor and reality has vanished. Words like erasure, annihilation, and uprooting are no longer just metaphors. They have become literal descriptions of what's happening. This regime of censorship and erasure doesn't stop in Gaza. It extends to Palestinians in 48, the West Bank, across the Arab world, and in the West. Everywhere we exist, we face an expanding system designed to silence our voices, erase our existence, and liquidate our cause. When The Question of Palestine was first published in 1979, it came just a few years before Israel's bloody invasion of Lebanon and the expulsion of the PLO and the committing of massacres against Palestinian and Lebanese people. It was written in a regional moment that wasn't favorable to the Palestinians. 45 years later, we find ourselves facing existential threats in a context that feels even more hostile. And now, Israel is carrying out its most violent campaign of mass killing and ethnic cleansing since the Nakba of 1948. You could read these 45 years as a repetition of history, or you could read them as a testament to Palestinian resilience and perseverance in the face of relentless violence and destruction. Many see Gaza as a site where history repeats itself, but I see it as a rupture in the century-long effort to erase and destroy Palestinian lives and futures and colonize their land. When Said wrote The Question of Palestine in 1979, he did so at a time when Palestinian writers and thinkers were fighting for what he called the permission to narrate. Against a backdrop of silencing and sanctioned ignorance, Said and others worked to carve out the space to tell our stories, assert our narratives, and make our case. Back then, ignorance was often the excuse. Many would say, we didn't know. But today, ignorance is no longer an excuse. The world knows. The proof of knowledge is everywhere. Most people, especially in the West, understand that a genocide is taking place. They understand the implications of allowing a regime like Israel's to operate without accountability. And yet, many choose to act as if nothing is happening. Some even cheer for this genocide, celebrating it as a model for dealing with populations deemed disposable. Today, the question of Palestine isn't just about Palestine. It's a universal question. It's about how power works, how the powerful decide the fate of millions, how militarism and surveillance dominate lives, and how entire populations are rendered rightless. It's about how some lives are made unworthy, their deaths never newsworthy. The question of Palestine helps us understand how we got here, how the Palestinian experience has unfolded, and how the world has repeatedly failed to hold Israel accountable. But it's also a witness. It stands as evidence against a world that had countless chances to know, to understand, and to act, but chose not to. As we mark the republication of this vital text, let it serve as a window into how these processes unfolded and as a lens for reflecting on the past to correct its injustices and shape a better future. It begins in our minds, with our words, and through our collective action. And finally, keep Gaza in your thoughts, in your hearts, and in your actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehad, for that video and for all the work that you do, and for that important reminder that it is precisely because ignorance is not winning out that scholasticide and erasure are such an integral part of what is unfolding in Gaza today, and that ignorance indeed is no excuse. Please also make sure that you pick up a copy of Light in Gaza from the bookstand outside as well. I promise you, you won't be disappointed if you haven't already got a copy. And it's now my honour to welcome Jacqueline Rose to the stage. Jacqueline is one of the most influential feminist psychoanalytic thinkers of our time. From her response in Said's Freud and the Non-European, to her own books such as The Question of Zion, Mothers, an essay on love and cruelty, and The Plague, to the essays that she's published over this past year, Jacqueline argues that we need psychoanalytic tools if we are to have any hope of navigating political crises. She is a professor and co-director of Birkbeck University's Institute for Humanities, so please join me in welcoming her.
I just want to start by saying what a huge honor it feels to have been invited to participate in this conversation, especially at a time like this. I want to start with two moments that I remember. One is a personal conversation with Wadie Said after one of Israel's many egregious atrocities towards the Palestinian people. And he just said, as almost like a throwaway line, the Israeli Jews will have to leave, as in any and many other failed colonial enterprises. And the other comment he made at a conference on the role of the public intellectual in Oxford in 2000, when he issued a type of warning. He said, the Israeli Jews can only be removed by creating a new generation of homeless, exiles, and refugees. Two questions. What would he have had to say? What would he have said today? And perhaps a more difficult question, what would he have said today about what he already said? So let me take two statements which I've sort of carried around with me for quite a long time from his writing. An essay called Bases of Coexistence. He said, we cannot coexist as two communities of detached and uncommunicatingly separate suffering. Can't we? How else can we live? What alternatives today are on offer? And the second one, which I think is really very, very powerful and evocative and very simple, he just said, there is suffering and injustice enough for everyone, to which one might want to say, is there? Rereading the Question of Palestine for this evening, what struck me, as it always does with his writing, is that rare, if not unique, gift of being able to give the full measure of the historical and psychic complexity of the situation in Palestine, and at the same time be unequivocally on the side of justice for his people. And on this he became more and more explicit, as we saw in those three captions from films with him that began us this evening. Look at the title of his book, The Question of Palestine, as if to say there is always a knowledge to be pursued, and we should never give up on that question, never close down the question of understanding, at the same time as the idea of the question of Palestine is a way of lamenting the invisible status of the Palestinians in Western thought. If the question is key, it is because for Said, language that tries to maintain its control over itself is part and parcel of the colonialist appropriation of the world, both word and world subject to false, discriminatory, imperialist mastery. Since Oslo, which was the time of the two quotations I read out, he did not stop exposing the failure or lie of the so-called peace process, brute mastery masquerading as dialogue, a cover for subjugation without end. This meant that his writing was as focused and angry as it was provisional and tentative, and I am still in awe of his unyielding ability to do both. Rereading the book, I was alerted again by the force of his critique or his resistance to the dispossession and subjugation of the Palestinians by the State of Israel, and also the nuances, the attention to the difficulties of the history, the moves he asks us to make, as, for example, two different versions of one essay, which became a central chapter of the Question of Palestine, the essay Zionism from the Standpoint of His Victims, which was first published in Social Text a good while before it became a key chapter in the Question of Palestine. I'm hoping the quote will be up there, but it's not, so I'm going to read it to you. One needs to repeat that what in Zionism served the no doubt fully justified ends of Jewish tradition, that fully was not in the first version. Saving the Jews as a people from homelessness and anti-Semitism, this comma is taken out in the second version, and restoring them to nationhood. Also collaborated with those aspects of the dominant Western culture in which Zionism exclusively, added later, institutionally lived, making it possible for Europeans to view non-Europeans as inferior, marginal, irrelevant. Now, the difference here, believe it or not, and it shows that I'm a literary person, hangs on that comma, depending on whether you include it or not. You can see him as asking, is nationhood one of the fully justified ends of Jewish tradition? on a par with saving Jews from homelessness and anti-Semitism? Or is it separate? Is it something else that cannot be run into those justified ends? A disappropriation and collaboration with dominant Western culture, which therefore becomes far less easily, certainly not straightforwardly justified, and it might even qualify as unjustified, which was something which, of course, thinkers such as Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, Ahad Ha'am, and many Jews, supporters of the Bund, not always honorable supporters of, e.g., conservative European Jews fearing loss of assimilation and pariah status. They all insisted, and many insist to this day, that the original constitution of the State of Israel was an injustice towards the Palestinian people and would fail. Martin Buber, where do truth and justice determine our deeds? Or again, this sort of Zionism, the one that had just taken over in 1948, blasphemes the name of Zion. Now, all of this, I think, brings us up against the psychoanalytic dimension which runs through the whole of Said's work. His willingness to raise these questions is what I'm saying. As he puts it, the task of criticism, or to put it another way, the role of the critical consciousness in such cases, is to be able to make distinctions, to produce differences where at present there are none. Or again, the consciousness of what one really is knowing thyself as the product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. To produce differences where at present there are none, an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory would do for me as a very good definition of psychoanalysis, even if the idea of such thinking, the very idea of such thinking, right now seems to be lost in the piles of the dead. To repeat, what would he have said? We have entered the most stubborn and self-defeating psychic terrain. The problem, or one of the problems, is that Israel as a nation simply sees things in the wrong place. Listen to the prescience of this quotation. Everything that did stay to challenge Israel was viewed as not as something there, but as something outside Israel and bent on its destruction from the outside. Israel cannot, will not see the people who, whether in refugee camps on the borders, the putative Palestinian state, or inside the country, the Israeli Arabs, or scattered all over the world, the Palestinian diaspora, are in fact politically and psychically in its midst. This is in fact far worse than merely two communities of uncommunicatingly separate suffering, which might suggest indifference or ignorance of a more straightforward kind. This is a historically embedded, violent failure of vision. In these readings, I suggest Said delved into the past, telling all the parties that alongside the struggle for historic justice and recognition for his people, the main critical and political task was to understand how and why. He described his own thinking as contrapuntal. He saw it as fundamental to any progressive vision of the future to hold on to refusal to resolve identity into herds, his word. Hence his interest in Freud at the basis of the last of his work to be published before he died, Freud and the Non-European of 2003, which I was delighted and moved to be asked to respond to when it was published as a book. This was the last of his works, and what he was appealing for was a different, more flexible subjectivity, which today seems never further out of reach. And it explains his enthusiasm for Freud's narrative of Moses, Freud's last work, which made him an Egyptian, and therefore against the grain of all killing national backstories, it made Moses a non-Jew. This is Said. Quite differently from the spirit of Freud's deliberately provocative reminders that Judaism's founder was a non-Jew and that Judaism belongs in the realm of Egyptian, non-Jewish monotheism, Israeli legislation countervenes, represses, and even cancels Freud's carefully maintained opening out of Jewish identity towards its non-Jewish background. So where does this leave us today? Some final statements from right at the end of the question of Palestine. Two things are certain. The Jews of Israel will remain. The Palestinians will also remain. Is that true? Nothing less than Palestinian self-determination will do. Well, he had moved on to the one-state solution by 2003. And then some Israelis and non-Israeli Jews have understood that if Israelis and Palestinians could have any decent future, it must be a common one, not based, listen to this, not based on the nullification of one by the other. Nullification being exactly what we are witnessing today and has been so far graphically described by our speakers. It is the genius of Said, or one of the many geniuses of Said, of this book, that it could see how high the stakes were and already see outlined on the horizon the nullification to come. To conclude, today the situation confronts us, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, with moments of speechlessness, as if there might now be only one thing and one word to say: genocide. I think Said's response would be yes and no. Genocide must be named, but it must not be given the last word. At the core of his engagement with writing and politics is that no word ever should. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I hope maybe that in this moment of genocide doesn't get the last word, because there are those who believe not in coexistence, but co-resistance together. And I think that is absolutely essential and one of the things that has changed, that we're seeing more and more co-resistance amongst Israelis and Palestinians, that runs deeper in understanding where we are than maybe during the Oslo period. Everybody on the stage here represents some part of Edward Said's legacy, and Budour Hassan is one of her generation's sharpest writers and commentators on literature, activism, disability, and feminism. She is Amnesty International's researcher for Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and I'm really honored to be able to welcome her now.
Good evening, everyone. So, in the preface to his 1991 edition of The Question of Palestine, Edward Said writes about how the fear of negation is one of the most principal fears that Palestinians have had since 1948. He goes on to say that Palestinians have been living with this confounding fear of disappearance. And we can read this fear of disappearance in many ways. We can read it as a metaphor. We can read it as a metaphor, for example, in the writings of Palestinian writers like Emil Habibi, how Palestinians have been made invisible by the Israeli state that colonized and occupied them and has failed to recognize them at all, not just as Palestinians, but as human beings. But we can also read it as physical, through the dispossession of 1948 that has continued ever since, even though in different ways and in different methods. And as we are seeing currently in Gaza with the fortification of military bases, the creation of a buffer zone, and then the buffer zone kind of molds these two elements of physical and a metaphor, because it's the buffer zone that through which Israel tries to treat Palestinians as invisible. And we can also read it as the legal fictions that Israel have established since the 1948, never more so as the creation of the term present absentee, the Palestinians who remained on their land but somehow were prevented from accessing their land or returning their land because Israeli laws decided that even though they are present on the land, they are absent. And Edward Said quite sharply talked about how Palestinians have always been tethering on this line of, even though they are present, Israel has treated them as absent. And this is why they have always fought this fear of becoming absent. So this is why this fear is not just an invention or a creation, it's something that Palestinians have been fighting to live with. When Edward Said wrote the first edition of the Question of Palestine, the central struggle of Palestinians was waged outside Palestine. It was waged through the reconstruction of the Palestinian identity, especially since 1948. After the rupture of 1948, Palestinians have had to start from scratch. They had to reconstruct their identity. They had to reconstruct their exiled identity, to form new communities away from home, to create home away from home, to create home in the several refugee camps, whether in the occupied West Bank or in the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon and many other Arab countries. But they also had to create home at home in Palestine, in the Palestinian cities after 1948, in Nazareth, in Haifa, and in many others, while they were dispossessed, while they were alienated. After now, as we speak, many have returned and recovered the center of the struggle to be inside Palestine. But that alienation continued. It continues despite the numerous uprisings that Palestinians have waged against Israeli occupation and dispossession. And this leads us to the second point that Edward Said mentions in his book and also in the preface to the edition, which is the irony. The irony which is, Edward Said describes it as an aesthetic dilemma, but it's not just purely aesthetic. It's the irony that is present at the heart of the Palestinian struggle, precisely at a time when Palestinians managed to reassert their existence, to form themselves to form their radical subjectivities, to form their political existence, to win so many battles, especially the battle for poetic justice, the battle for existence, for their drama to be recognized as a drama of persistence, defiance, and self-determination. It's precisely at these times when Israel's dispossession of Palestinian land, Israel's brutality has been at its worst. And one wonders, how can we reconcile between these two? How can we reconcile between the fact that we have been seeing hundreds of thousands of people protest all over the world in solidarity with Palestinians? We have been seeing new generations who probably 20 years ago didn't hear of Palestine, didn't care about Palestine, didn't realize that Palestine is part and parcel of a broader struggle for social justice and freedom, are now taking to the streets, or maybe their children are taking to the streets. They're saying Free Palestine, knowing what Free Palestine means. They're saying Free Palestine because they believe that freedom for Palestine is part of a broader struggle all over the world for economic justice, for climate justice. But also, at the same time, we're seeing how almost fruitless some of these protests are, because we've seen how the onslaught in Gaza continues. We have seen what Edward Said described as the asymmetric record of destruction, and he said the word back in the 1970s. But now this asymmetric record of destruction, it has never been more asymmetric, and the destruction has never been at this scale that we are witnessing. Edward Said reminds us that the destruction has always been there. It's always characterized Israel's attempts to negate and to erase Palestinians. And I here wonder, what would have he said about what we are witnessing now? The thing about Edward Said is he asks many questions. He doesn't answer some of these questions. So when he asks about how can we reconcile this dilemma, how can we think about what we as Palestinians are witnessing in terms of losing our cities, losing our land progressively, but also winning battles, winning more recognition for our freedom, he doesn't have an answer for this question. And it is, I think, our obligation to think, maybe one of the reasons why there is such a gap between what we are seeing in terms of people recognizing the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause, Palestinians, especially new generations of Palestinians, managing to reassert the justice of their cause, but also, on the other hand, the brutality of the onslaught has never been as great as it is right now, is maybe this need to create a new language. And again, we return, the question of language has always been central to Edward Said. And again, Edward Said tells us that this is not purely an aesthetic question. It's a question that, question of reclamation, how to reclaim the narrative, how to try to reimagine the ways in which we struggle. Maybe it's time for also us who are taking to the streets to think differently about how we can regain and how we can be more critical of the political, social, religious leadership that has characterized the Palestinian cause. And this is thirdly the importance of Edward Said. When Edward Said wrote in the 1970s the question of Palestine, he did not treat any of the Palestinian leaders as icons who were above criticism. And I think he at one point he said he's not a detached observer, but he had this privilege maybe to be distance. The privilege of distance that maybe he was not inside Palestine. He could speak as intellectual, he could speak in English, which gave him this maybe luxury or privilege to be more critical. But on the other hand, he was speaking through the eyes of a witness and a victim. He was a victim because he was also prevented from returning home. He was a victim because he was also dispossessed, and he was coming from a family of people who are dispossessed. And he was a witness because he realized what bearing witness means. For Edward Said and many others, bearing witness can be a physical burden, because to bear witness is to try and speak, to take your privilege as someone who has this access, especially to Western academia, to say stuff that so many people inside Palestine were not allowed to say. So he took it to the extreme, and we see it not just in the book Question of Palestine. We see it through his interviews, through his comments, through the lectures that he gave. He understood the importance of witnessing, the importance of recording the Palestinian story, of recording the Palestinian narrative, and again of reclaiming not just this permission to narrate, but also this permission to be heard, to have your story recognized as it should be recognized, and not just to speak because you want to please someone else. And also not just to speak in order to be loved or liked by the leadership or by the mainstream Palestinian or other and Arab leadership. And finally, and this is why the book is more relevant and remains relevant, we all are here talking as we are witnessing what's happening in Gaza. And I always wonder, and we all have been wondering, what would have Edward Said said? It's not like we have a shortage of Palestinian intellectuals who can speak to the current moment with strength and with courage. But with Edward Said, we think that would he have written anything that could have probably helped us reclaim our language? As I was rereading the Question of Palestine, we all, I think, realized the gap that Edward Said's absence has left behind. We were all looking and searching for a voice that not only could speak about the cataclysmic situation that we are witnessing, but not only could document what we are witnessing, but that could help us mourn. In his memoirs especially, and in his autobiographical writings, Edward Said mourned the loss of his hometown of Jerusalem. He mourned the loss of the Palestine that was before 1948. He allowed himself to grieve the loss of the culture, of the city, of the people, of an atmosphere, of a world that never returned. And I think now, as we are witnessing what's happening in Gaza, we have been denied this right to mourn. There is no space to grieve. There is no space not only to grieve all those who are dead, to remember them, to honor them, to have funerals for them, to bury them with dignity, to bury them in peace. We have not been able even to mourn the loss of the city, of the coastal city, of the traditions, of the cultures. We have not been able to say how beautiful and contradictory and complicated and messy and beautiful Gaza was before the current genocide. We have not been able to say how, even though it was under siege, how dehumanizing the word open prison to describe Gaza was, because even though it was under a blockade, it was a living reenactment of what Edward Said would describe as the drama of Palestinian existence. And I think finally, this is the strength of Edward Said's writing, that he was able to see the full spectrum of Palestinian humanity, to always see the Palestinian human as the center, as the main actor of their own drama or her own drama, to see the complexity of the Palestinian humanity. Yes, the mistakes and the failures, but despite all these mistakes and all these failures and the fragility and the unlearned lessons, there is this yearning always for freedom, for justice, for dignity that has characterized the Palestinian struggle since 1948. Thank you.
Well, there may be a gap, but I think, Budour, you always find a way to fill it. You're quite astounding, and it's an absolute honor to hear you speak. Max Porter is up next, an author of musicality and drama, of performance and poise that would no doubt have thrilled Said. Max is a frequent collaborator with artists across disciplines and a teacher of creative writing in British prisons. He is the author of 4 novels, and his work has been translated into 34 languages. Right now, he is the chair of the judges for the International Booker Prize, so please join me in welcoming him now.
It's too much. It's too much. Reread Said after your trip to Palestine. Write about your experience. What do questions of literary style mean now when every utterance is a failure? Consider Edward Said's gorgeous, refined, late 20th century academic prose style, his thinking which always zinged, his sentences which still sing. How do we write about Beethoven, about Eurocentric prejudice? How do you write about tonality, performance, or war, or about Zionism? How do you write about Wagner and anti-Semitism? How do you write about art, injustice? What style is required to communicate the Palestinian struggle to an English readership? What literary style beyond a scream can survive this chapter? So, Jerusalem peace. A failure. The visitor stands in the bright light of Al-Aqsa compound, the noble sanctuary, and contemplates the sudden extraordinary sense of peace after the busy commotion of the city. He closes his eyes and he can hear birdsong, gentle chatter, and the soft slip-slap of bare feet on ancient stone. He rests his hands on the dusty ground beside an olive tree and feels thousands of years of history pulse beneath his touch. The wisdom of the tree, the dignity of the tree is a lesson. No! Fuck off with this kind of thing now, Max. Who is this bollocks for? Write it properly or don't write it at all. The bare feet belong to an illegal settler, making his way across this sacred space accompanied by his armed security guard. Uniform, gun, inside, outside, across this sacred space. Last week, 2021, 1936, 70 CE, 1099, since October. The most politically charged and densely populated 14 hectares on the planet, but so peaceful. Volatile, weird, guns in the sanctuary, bullet holes in the walls, apocalyptic thinking, wildly disrespectful and disruptive architectural and military impositions which make a sick sense because, pray, evidence, tension. Hold on, I just want you to see, look, those women, they are the Marabitat. They dedicate their lives to protecting this space, to keeping a Palestinian presence in this space because, hang on, I'm failing to reconcile what I've read with what I'm seeing. Because, well, the Waqf and the soldiers have different ideas about this, that door, heat, peace, sheer age, layers, because what might a literary style that can adequately express this travesty feel like, sound like the testimonies from Gaza we heard last night? My 25-year-old annotations in the margins, look at the guards on the gate, that's new, because there is a slow-motion devastation occurring here alongside, tethered to, the whispered and encrypted and biblically wishful end times beneath the rock, ready to erupt, as if, but whatever. What good will come of challenging the doctrine when one hand holds a Bible and the other an assault rifle? Speechless, we feel invisible. Outside later, what a strange idea of safety this is. We are past the ticketed Western two sides empathy games, the everyone feels better, warm glow, hope is the thing with false equivalence games. These games are a slow motion degradation of violence upon the oppressed because the oppressor is allowed to play at being equal. Sharing minutes, sharing hours, days, flesh, the page, the stage. Look at this stone, this light, these tiles, and reconcile it with our destruction. Where does that leave Palestine? Unchanged, tragically, in its own singular abandonment and crisis. So the piece is going to sicken you. You need to understand that. Whatever you write will feel inadequate, crass, gauche. It is. Earlier, many of us do not agree with these ideas. Time is the cruelest weapon. Outside, blue, coffee, cardamom, sweets, American Zionists. The question cannot be made to go away. The man brings us mayo to dip our chips in, and we are glad to have shawarma, but it's not as good as last night in Ramallah, and we pause our conversation about Zadie Smith's words are weapons of mass destruction piece as the owner draws up a chair and tells us about the arrest of his brother. Overlap, blue, green, gold, mosque. The sense always at the full extent to which these people have been failed cannot be grasped or signposted by written history or even marked and navigated by global interventions or signposted by written history or even marked and navigated because of individual atrocities or the enduring discourse of freedom set against or underpinned or made sense of by resistance, by hope, later, Via Dolorosa. Wow, look, logic, fairness, law, everything has failed. Please tell them you're my friend and hug them on my behalf. Please visit on my behalf Al-Bandali. It's the best hummus in the world. Outside, back inside. The testimonies we heard from Gaza last night, the child we met for breakfast, his love of dinosaurs, his love of spaceships, his universal boyness, before or after Fatimid inscription, European tourists, overwhelm, erasure, jokes, hospitality. The man brings us mayo to dip our chips in, and we are glad to have shawarma, but it's not as good as last night in Ramallah. And we pause our conversation about Ta-Nehisi Coates' interview on CBS as the owner draws up a chair and tells us about the inch-by-inch destruction of the East Jerusalem business community, about the business plan of America and Israel and the tragic failure of the wider Arab solidarity in the face of the global world order. And we will sleep underneath that tree by the gate if we have to. We can never be made to leave this land. It is our home. Right there, it happened right there. Yes, karama, like a dignity, I guess. Look, they're about to close it since the Abraham Accords, since October. It's unimaginable now. He's saying no phones. He's saying, get off your phone. Get off your phone. Give me your phone. No phones. We need new words. The scale of it. The cheek of it. I keep saying the fucking cheek of it. Brazen, scandalous, outrageous, immoral. The words clatter to the ground and smash. They fall pathetically short. What is a novelist or a journalist or a singer or a bird or a cockroach supposed to say? This is ordinarily incredibly busy, but since October they've shut most of the businesses here down. Well, you can see for yourself. Flag. That flag means settled. Overlap. Forgot. Who was it was telling us about the boy? A canary in a cage. A designated terrorist organization. Human rights law. There is a before and after we heard the story. A day feels like a week. The testimonies from Gaza we heard last night. This full Madomas is delicious, spicier than normal, but it works. I'm in Ramallah, the rockets from Iran glowing overhead and fizzing out as they hit the Iron Dome. Fancy me, a lifelong pacifist and a staunch critic of Israel's military industrial psychopathology, feeling a fleeting gratitude for the Iron Dome. And I feel sick. I feel sick to my stomach. Toot, toot, horns beeping, jubilation in the streets because Iran is showing what it can do if pushed. And my companions and I couldn't do much about the rockets, so we went for ice cream. The testimonies from Gaza we heard last night. Outside, between the fight we saw in the church, buckets of gummy sweets, never seen it so quiet. The literature of this place slams around my mind somewhat grotesquely. I am predictably Orientalist in my preparation for these holy lands. Somewhat crass for asking for Raja's signature. Somewhat earnest, heavy backpack full of imposter syndrome and guilt, shame and Englishness. Brexit blue passport waved through as my Arab travelling companions are withheld. I'll get on the Wi-Fi and sing what the West are saying. We can get out and walk. Oh, you must get out and walk so you can experience the new Kalandia. Free Barghouti. Fast forward to the bright pink pickled cucumber, before, after. Can I ask them if you met any of the settlers? Did you meet any settlers and ask how they felt? Flashback to Hebron's hideous illegal additions, plonked on the old city, razor wire, shameless, gun tower crazed, fit of harassment, brick by brick, street by street, year upon year. The Guardian piece, my God, did you read it? Time-lapse visits over 30 years to see what the colonial tide has stolen. These steps were once bustling with Palestinian life, and now look, enter, maybe slip your Instagram to private, because they might open your phone, and if they see any pro-Palestinian stuff, it could slow us down a lot, and we kind of need to get going. Exit yesterday, a group of settlers screaming, "Yak help, fucking dog!" at an Arab. After lunch before October, this is not a one-size-fits-all myth of human pain. This is a precisely Palestinian tragedy. There is a violent machinery of disregard for Palestinian life that is ideologically underpinned but always shifting, always learning, always changing, always improving its methods, gathering technological and geopolitical impetus, while the victim remains locked in the cruel experiment and has no right of reply. The settlers are newly emboldened. I have to try and get at the fracturing, the head fuck, the mental whoosh and clap between the appalling and the inspiring. Hey, American, fuck you! American, fuck you! American! Camo IDF cap, a mountain of zatar, a foot-high slab of nougat, a man in green cargo shorts and a white vest with a Texas accent and an MK-18 American-supplied close-quarters battle receiver. I've skipped forward to where my friend points and says, that weird wooden caterpillar thing they built there. Have you read Ahdaf Soueif's piece about Jerusalem? The language of justice and decency is no longer relevant. The language of human rights is bitter. Here in the heart of the world that will burst soon. The testimonies from Gaza we heard last night. So that's the Wailing Wall Plaza, chariots to heaven. Before I went, 3 weeks after, when I got back, when Smotrich unveils annexation plans, 3 months ago at a literary festival where a very famous writer screamed at me, called me a woke fucking letter-signing moron for using the G word. He said it's not a genocide, it's war crimes. Just war crimes. And let me tell you, like it or not, war crimes happen. Yesterday, next week, 2020, digging into the foundations of civilization to prove one point among many, what has been bulldozed and chucked aside to get at what they want this wall to mean. You. Where are you from? You, go. Not you. You, stay. You, no, all right, go. No, you can go. Go. There is a devastation occurring here by gradual increments and a full-speed genocide occurring 47 miles to the west. There is a lurch. Tomorrow they will use an F-15 to bomb the West Bank for the first time in 24 years. That's a fast forward. That's a we're next for the people who have been screaming, we will be next, to a world who will not stop this because of the economic, political and racial dynamics that have allowed this devastation to continue, flourish, expand, become entrenched, explode. Children as young as 14 in administrative detention. A week later, teaching in the prison, and they're mad about Palestine. All this, but with no parole, no lawyer, no crime. I tell them the numbers and they shake their heads. It's fucking dystopian, bruv. A full year has passed. We can now say the world has burst, overlap, consistency, shock. We know they will come. They always come. It's a question of when. Wait. You, give me your phone. Inside again, the whole colossal prison they're in is built for fear. It is a fear experiment. A man is explaining, that when they host visitors, they often feel like a broken record. He's saying things are so bad now here up in the hills, surrounded since October the 7th. People are not coming to see us. It's very hard to communicate. And so many people, European charities, NGOs, yeah, they come and they've made promises, but nothing has happened. And he's saying, outside. The New York Times piece, my God, did you read it? The world burst, wooden bridge, body parts in plastic bags, fly-posted end times. They search his Twitter for the phrase, condemn Hamas, weeping on the floor 10 days later, morning, checkpoint, waiting. The psychogeography of the place is by design baffling. Outside again, morning, my sister-in-law, half Palestinian, is in Jordan, texting me. My uncle got so angry last night talking about the Nakba he couldn't speak. Then the rockets went over and he sat on the balcony and silently nodded. Give me your passport, give me your phone, wall to your left, wall to your right, closed to you, not to you, open to you, closed to them, closed for no reason, closed for 1,000 interlocking, non-communicated reasons under the banner of the too mild word apartheid, under the banner illegal occupation. He points there and says, that's a new settlement. That wasn't even here last year. And he points and says, that's one of the big UNRWA camps, and however well-versed one is in Balfour, 48, 67, Oslo, First Intifada, Second Intifada, waves of demolition, settler behavior then, settler behavior since October, however up-to-date one is, the sheer infrastructural discombobulation is viscerally disruptive, as it is intended to be. No stress, says Allah, our driver. They shut one way, we find another. We're very good at this now. Olé, they did just shut the gate. Do the Bath thought experiment. Do the Bath thought experiment. No, I can't, it's naff. No, do it. It problematizes something we're all part of. It's in the realm of digestible data for emotional trickery, something cynical about it, like those tweets which ask us to imagine St. Thomas's, Guy's, St. Mary's, Bart's, King's, every hospital in London bombed. The post which says, 2,000 dead in New York. And then it says, it's Lebanon, but admit you startled in a different way. But really, I'm all for it. If it feels like a trite maneuver at a safe distance, it's gross because we are gross. The world is grossly off its axis. So, okay, I live in Bath, which is a UNESCO heritage city, as Hebron is, as Bethlehem is. The stone glows in the same way. Evidence of Roman engineering peeks through the pavements, but Bath is free, owned but free. It's a strange, broadly monocultural place, very pretty, lots of tourists, lots of bookshops, lots of rugby. A liberal city, weekly protests for Palestine, proactive Green councillors, bigotry mostly kept buried with occasional flare-ups on the dad's WhatsApp groups. It was grimly irresistible at an emotional level to do the thought experiment. So I imagined Bath blocked off, no entry on the A36, bypasses and roundabouts replaced by checkpoints, park and rides replaced by gunned roadblocks, a surveillance tower plonked atop the Roman baths, armed men walking the streets, the Abbey split in two, surrounded by gated security, a permit required to go to Bristol or London, raids on homes, my 15-year-old son detained, no reason given. They are killing our children. Shootings on Milsom Street, shootings in Victoria Park, no news of my son after a week, a month, no lawyer, no visits. The university's raided, the power's suddenly off, the mains water shut off. 47 miles to the west, South Wales has been flattened. My uncles and aunts are dead. My cousins are dead. They estimate it could maybe be 200,000 people dead and most of the population displaced and starving. How can this happen to us, we would ask? Is the world not watching? And there's a sick lack of depth to the thought experiment because it wouldn't happen to us, because look at the skin we're in. And there's a sick little perversion at the bottom of the thought experiment, which is that I wish the world was reordered so that it could happen to us, that the gap could somehow be closed. I wish it could be undone, what has been done to them, but it can't. It is done. Done with our pen and partly with our gun. I can play whatever imaginary games I want in my head. I can recruit others to play them with me, but the structuring isms, bluntly Zionism, capitalism, racism, remain the same. I feel sick for having indulged in this unsophisticated ritual, even briefly for 30 seconds on the bus as the wall snakes along beside us. In the evening, we are listening to the writer Budour Hassan share some of her experiences of recording testimonies from Gaza for Amnesty International. She's talking specifically about fathers who have lost their entire families. When she leaves, I check my phone and I have a text message reminding me that the under-9s training session tonight will be rainy and the boys should remember their waterproofs. To remind all parents, please make sure your kids have waterproofs. I won't be able to slip back into my life after this. I won't want to. I sat with Rema Hamami and we talked of terrible things, but also wonderful things, like the translation she and Berger did of Mahmoud Darwish's mural. Life is a shadow of something we can't see. Everything on earth is ephemeral. So what's Jerusalem? And what's a throne if nothing remains forever? We spoke about Edward Said's Question of Palestine, and she explained the importance of that book for diaspora Palestinians in the 80s and 90s. It was the book. But now look. Said says in the very famous TV interview, to be Palestinian is to be already criminalized, already a delinquent. To speak out now for Palestine is to be delinquent, or virtue signaling, or ignorant, or anti-Semitic, a terrorist sympathizer, or woke, naive, Said called with singular rigour and eloquence for legitimacy, visibility. He called for the sheer enormity of the situation to be recognised. He wrote, "Avoidance, force, fear, and ignorance will no longer serve." And we wondered what Said would make of this appalling moment in the ongoing history of appalling moments for Palestine and its people. The sheer enormity, the force, the fear, the ignorance. "I cannot believe where we've ended up," she said. "After the first intifada, if you told me we'd end up here," she was speechless. And then she said, "It's too much. It's too much." 40 years ago, Said diagnosed a geopolitical sickness, lamented the failures of the world, and was already amazed at the sheer length of time that Palestine had suffered the indignities of occupation. The longest military occupation of the century, he called it, 4 decades ago. And now a devastation has occurred in Gaza that no sane person could have imagined, because it is insane. It is psychopathic violence, not merely a savagely disproportionate response. 20 years ago, in her book, The Question of Zion, Jacqueline Rose quotes Staff Sergeant Liran Ron Fuhrer, recalling his experience in Gaza. "Over time, our behavior became normative, without fear of punishment, without oversight, a place to test how tough, how callous, how crazy we could be. A prophecy now fulfilled. How callous, how crazy. A visible genocide awaiting the world's confirmed linguistic diagnosis while we still supply the bombs to guarantee it will get it. The terms, techniques, materials, and motivations have always been transparent. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine in plain sight. And Palestinian writers, academics, and journalists continue to contextualize it and report it even as they are discredited, arrested, silenced, even as they are systematically murdered, hunted. In this appalling new reality, the rigour and clarity of Said's 46-year-old argument is still necessary. It somehow seems tragically abstract or rarefied or academic, but the facts of it starkly remain. His argument is profoundly relevant to the annihilation in Gaza, to the violence in the West Bank, to the sheer relentless ongoingness of the persecution of the Palestinian people day by day, news story by news story. He wrote in 1979, "The task for the Palestinian people is to assure its presence on the land. There is no other acceptable alternative." He wrote again in the revised 1992 edition, "The task for the Palestinian people is still to assure its presence on the land. There is no other acceptable alternative." It falls to every non-Palestinian citizen of this world to insist on this in our writing, speaking, thinking, acting, voting, in every breath, with every utterance. Palestine must survive, must be free. There is no other acceptable alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, for that painfully exquisite encapsulation of what language can't and can communicate. It's an honor now to introduce Avi Shlaim. Avi was born as an Arab Jew in Baghdad in 1945, but found himself growing up in a new country called Israel, a story which he chronicles beautifully in his recent memoir, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Like Said, his work is conducted in the shadow of a city lost, a culture destroyed, a life out of place. Avi grew up to become a historian and has worked within the discipline to refute the myths that Israel constructed for itself and that it requires for its ongoing colonization of Palestine. His newest book, Genocide in Gaza, Israel, Hamas, and the Long War on Palestine, is out just this month. And again, there will be signed copies on the bookstand after the event. So please welcome Avi Shlaim.
Good evening. I had the pleasure and the privilege of knowing Edward Said personally. I did not know him well, but to borrow a phrase from Ahdaf Soueif, I was one of Edward Said's 3,000 close friends. The key to Edward's extensive and prolific work on Israel-Palestine is humanism. He famously described the Palestinians as the victims of victims, and he spoke of Jews and Palestinians not just as enemies, but as two communities of suffering. In his article, Basis for Coexistence, he pleaded for Arab recognition of Jewish suffering and victimhood. But his compassion for Jewish suffering was accompanied by an insistent demand that Israel recognize its own culpability for the plight of the Palestinians and redress the injustice, the monumental injustice it had done to them. Edward told me that for this one article in Al-Nahar, he received more flack than for anything else that he had ever published throughout his career. The criticisms came from Arabs, and they said to him, "You have become an apologist for the Jews." Well, he was not an apologist for the Jews. But he understood, as not all Arabs do, that because of the Holocaust, the Palestinians face the most morally complex of all opponents. And he continued to articulate his inclusive vision at every conceivable opportunity. From today's perspective, with Israel perpetrating genocide in Gaza, this emphasis on Jewish victimhood seems questionable, to say the least. What is not questionable is the relevance of the book, The Question of Palestine, and we are here to celebrate the republication of this classic. Edward's main purpose of the book was to counter the massive accumulation of lies, distortions, and willful ignorance that surrounded the Palestinian struggle at that time. This book is no less relevant today, as some of the other speakers have already pointed out, no less relevant than it was in 1979. This is because the lies about the Palestinians, the dehumanization of the Palestinians, has reached an unprecedented low with Israel's genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. Edward was not a historian, but he had a deep interest in the history and historiography of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The late 1980s witnessed the emergence of the so-called new history in Israel. Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, and I published books, and collectively we became known as the Israeli revisionists, or just the new historians. Our work was a frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. After these books were published, I received a letter from Edward from Columbia. He said, well done, but this is not enough. It's not enough for Israeli scholars to criticize the conduct of the government in 1948. Let us have a conference in Oxford of historians, Jewish, Israeli, and Arab historians, to take a comprehensive look at what happened in that fateful year, to examine, quote, the moral and political consequences of 1948. And I'll always remember that for Edward, the moral preceded the political consequences of 1948. The result of this initiative was a volume co-edited by Eugene Rogan, my colleague at the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, a volume called The War for Palestine, Rewriting the History of 1948. All the chapters were written by historians, but at the end of the book there was an afterword by Edward Said. It was called Afterword, The Consequences of 1948. And this is the most eloquent and elegantly written account of Edward's engagement with the Palestinian issue. Edward valued the new history for three reasons, or he gave three reasons. One is the new history educated the Israeli public about the history of the conflict. Second, it gave the Palestinians an account of history which was truthful, which was genuine, which was in line with their own experience in 1948, instead of the usual propaganda of the victors. And thirdly, it created a climate of opinion on both sides of the divide that was conducive to mutual understanding and reconciliation. It was in that climate that Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accord in 1993. But that was not the kind of accommodation that Edward was calling for. In fact, it was the opposite of what he was calling for. He therefore launched a blistering attack on the Oslo Accord and its authors in a series of articles in newspapers that were collected in 2 volumes of essays. The October 1993 issue of the London Review of Books carried 2 articles, one by Edward, a critique of Oslo, and one by me, which was a defense of Oslo. Edward's article was called A Palestinian Versailles. So the Oslo Accord for him was an instrument of Palestinian surrender. I recognized all the shortcomings of the Oslo Accord, but I defended it as a modest step in the right direction and predicted that eventually it would lead to a Palestinian state alongside Israel. With hindsight, 30 years on, it's crystal clear that I was wrong and Edward was right in his analysis. For the Palestinians, the Oslo Accord turned out to be not a station on the road to statehood, but a trap. It was a historic blunder for which the Palestinians are still paying the price today. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about Edward's lesser-known book, Freud and the Non-European, which, as Jacqueline pointed out earlier, was Edward's last book. And this was a commentary on Sigmund Freud's last book, Moses and Monotheism. Edward used Freud's book to argue that there is no such a thing as a pure Jewish identity. He used it to show that Judaism used to be open to its non-European background. Moses and monotheism reinforced Edward's notion of complex, nuanced identities. I myself am an Arab Jew. I was born in Baghdad and I grew up in Israel. When reading Freud and the Non-European, I discovered a new sense of affinity with Moses, were both Arab Jews. Last year, as Aimee pointed out, I published a kind of autobiography, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. For me, the notion of an Arab Jew is not a contradiction in terms, as it is for most Israelis. It's not an ontological impossibility, but a meaningful identity. For me, as for Ella Shohat, who was a friend of Edward's, the hyphen does not divide. The hyphen in Arab Jew does not divide, it unites. For my family and me in Baghdad, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not an abstract idea or a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. My experience, therefore, enables me to try and imagine a better future for our region instead of the dismal reality that we face today. I'm proud of my Arab heritage and equally proud of my Jewish heritage. The basic values of Judaism are altruism, truth, justice, and peace. The present Israeli government is the antithesis of these core Jewish values. The core of Judaism is non-violence. Israeli society today could not be more viciously violent and genocidal. So as a Jew and as an Israeli, I feel I have a moral duty to stand by the Palestinians in their hour of need when they are under such vicious attack. Long ago, I've given up the idea of a two-state solution. Israel killed it. Israel killed it by settlements and everything else that it has done. I therefore advocate one state from the river to the sea with equal rights one state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity. By different routes, Edward and I have reached the same conclusion: one inclusive state with equal rights. This is what Edward wrote in conclusion to the article Basis for Coexistence. Quote, "The simple fact is that the Jewish and Palestinian experiences are historically, indeed organically connected. To break them asunder is to falsify what is authentic about each. We must think of our histories together in order for there to be a common future. And the future must include Arabs and Jews together, free from any exclusionary denial-based schemes for shutting out one side by the other. That is the real challenge. That the rest is much easier," unquote. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Avi. You give us hope that we can rise to the real challenge. We have also tonight the great luck of hearing the next 2 speakers who are going to take the stage together. Wadie Said, Edward Said's son, is a professor of law whose work is at the intersections of immigration, foreign policy, and human rights. He's a professor of law and Dean's Faculty Fellow at the University of Colorado School of Law. And Tamim Barghouti is probably the most well-known and loved Arabic poet alive today. He is the son of Mourid al-Barghouti and esteemed poet, who was an esteemed poet and memoirist. who has resonated widely in English in translated words, such as I Saw Ramallah. So please welcome to the stage Wadie and Tamim.
Thank you all for being here, and to Omar and Yasmin and the rest of the PalFest organizers for having me in this event. When the Question of Palestine first came out, I was 7 years old, so I was not able to read it until around a decade or so later. At that point, I recognized that my father had been telling me all along the facts and figures that demonstrated the great crime of the dispossession of the Palestinians from 1948 onward, in ways that a child would be able to understand. To grow up in New York in the 1970s and 1980s was to appreciate that Palestine, the word itself and what it symbolized, was not a normal term. For many, they would have no idea what you were referring to when you said, I am Palestinian. And for the majority of those who understood the intent behind that phrase, it was as if you were spoiling for a fight. This book is the first great and concerted effort to change that reality, a marshaling of a sustained and exceptionally detailed argument that we, in fact, do exist, and that we have a right to the liberation of our land to which we will return. As a lawyer, I understand a legal brief, and this book, while much more eloquent and readable than any legal document, offers a defense of a people so often maligned and neglected, along with a description of their many conditions and variegated populations, to conclusively prove the existence and durability of the Palestinian identity, regardless of what Western officialdom or Zionism itself had to say, as well as a direct and multi-layered rejection of the Palestinian as terrorist trope that the other side still so desperately clings to. While the timing of the book was crucial for establishing that identity, so much has changed since then, as is painfully obvious given the genocide in Gaza, the assault on Lebanon, the menacing specter of ethnic cleansing and settler violence in the West Bank, and the brazenly open internecine violence of criminal gangs in the 1948 Palestinian community, to which the Israeli police, mystifyingly, seem to have no response, in contrast to its heavy-handed and repressively swift responses to any manifestations of peaceful opposition to its genocidal war against that same population, a situation we recognize in the United States as the over-policing, under-policing problem. The question of Palestine allows us to take stock of where we were and how far we have come. For example, no one, save religious fanatics or blind ideologues, questions Palestinian identity anymore. And much of the world understands how just our cause is. But it stands in contrast to the other two books in my father's most enduring trilogy. While Orientalism, the concept, is still much in evidence in American, British, German, Israeli, French, etc., governmental and media attitudes to the Palestinian cause, and what we refer to now as Islamophobia means that Covering Islam, the book, could simply be updated by changing the names and dates of its journalistic entries. The Question of Palestine references Palestinian identity at a particular time in a particular place. With this new edition, with Saree's brilliant preface, we see the evolution of my father's thinking, as it also includes his path-breaking 1999 essay on the one-state solution, as it should be now plain that partition of the land, a horrible idea created by people in this country, with terrible results worldwide, is patently infeasible. But rereading the book also allows me to notice something about my father's thinking. Towards the end of his life, he made frequent reference to the fact that he was at peace with the idea of his being at home in exile in New York, and that he probably would not have left it even were Palestine to be liberated. With further reflection, I'm not so sure. You can read in these pages how important it was for him to be part of the national movement, as his membership in the Palestine National Council proves, and through his painstaking description of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, of which he was not a member, incidentally. He did not remain in the National Council and fell out with the leadership of the PLO for their inexcusable sin of signing on to the Oslo Accords and what followed them, but he was committed to his people and was never more at home than when he was with them, in exile or in the occupied land itself. As proof of this attachment, he helped start a new political movement, the Palestinian National Initiative, with Haidar Abdushafi, Ibrahim Da'a, and Mustafa al-Barghouti in the last year of his life, while he was basically on his deathbed, to insist on his attachment and duty to his people. His embrace of exile, while certainly rooted in practical concerns like teaching at a major university and many decades of residence in New York City, was perhaps a defense mechanism against being disappointed that he would not be reunited with his family and friends in Palestine, even though his hope for liberation and return never died. And we have his example to continue to lead us on that path. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. The question that comes to mind when a war of such proportions as the one now going on in Gaza erupts is how and when will it end? In the coming few minutes, I will try to speak about that in the light of the ideas of Wadie Said and his comrades, and in the light of the ideas you've heard here tonight. The conditions that cause a war, the conditions that cause a war are different from the events that trigger it. This war has two main causes. The first is demographic. 3/4 of a century after what Ilan Pape calls the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, Israel has failed to maintain a Jewish majority in the land it controls between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. The Palestinian majority in historical Palestine is youthful, poor, and armed to varying degrees. It has more to live and less to lose, and it has not given up on its right to the entirety of mandatory Palestine. The second cause is geostrategic. For the first time since 1948, Israel faces a regional alliance that stretches from the Caspian to the Mediterranean. Far from being an alliance of centralized, colonially created states with dependent economies and weak police-like regular armies, it is an alliance of experts in long-term asymmetrical guerrilla warfare. In fact, it was through surviving a series of long civil wars and foreign occupations that this alliance came into being in the first place. This alliance draws on the strategic capabilities of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Palestine, with a combined population of about 200 million. The events of the 7th of October 2023 were not in and of themselves an existential threat to the nuclear regional superpower that is Israel. But the underlying conditions that made it possible are causing Israel's existential fear today. It follows that Israel cannot be considered to have won this war unless it neutralizes the two reasons for which it erupted: Palestinian demography and the regional alliance. While achieving these two goals might be possible, it is unlikely. The driving out of 7 million Palestinians, or a sizable portion of them, today is much more difficult than the forceful displacement of 1/10 of that number 76 years ago. Such a move will jeopardize the stability and even the existence of some Arab states who have peace treaties and are friendly with Israel. We should not forget that Israel and the current political map in the Middle East both were born of the same colonial womb after World War I. Israel is in such a condition today that to survive, it must eat its siblings. For the first time in 100 years, a contradiction seems to have arisen between the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Israel is threatening the colonial setting that allowed it to exist in the first place. The colonial arrangement is thus contradicting itself, which Edward Said tells us is not uncommon. Israel will have to pacify the entirety of West Asia, a task that the United States failed to achieve at a much smaller scale in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nonetheless, in war, while some outcomes are more likely than others, it is still a fact that all outcomes are possible. It has been common knowledge for thousands of years that people know how a war starts, but no one knows how it will end. For the past year, in hopes for an early ceasefire, and in spite of Israel killing Lebanese, Palestinian, and Iranian leaders from Gaza to Tehran, the Lebanese and the Iranians seemed hesitant to respond in ways that might lead to an all-out regional war. If this trend continues, and if Israel is not otherwise deterred, the danger of a new Nakba becomes greater by the hour. Israel has made its intentions clear. It shall continue its suffocation of Gaza with or without a ceasefire, in what Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sittah calls post-ceasefire genocide. Moreover, Israeli ministers are clearly stating that the year 2025 shall be the year of the annexation of the West Bank. Israel can annex the less populated areas, so-called areas C and B under the Oslo Accords, which comprise almost 90% of the West Bank, and turn the densely populated towns into mini Gazzas, and wait for economic suffocation to reduce the population by migration. If the heavy civilian losses of this war convince the Palestinian population that resistance is futile or even harmful, then there will be no point in having any form of resistance in Lebanon or in the wider region. At that point, and only at that point, can Israel claim victory. Look again, though. Such an Israeli victory depends on one variable. You can call it hesitation, intimidation, or despair by the Iranians, the Lebanese, the Palestinians, and their allies. That is, Israel can only win if her enemies give up. If they don't, despite the imbalance of power, despite the unbearable human cost, neither Israel nor Israel's international allies have the military capacity to end the war in Israel's favor. In asymmetrical wars, if the regular army does not win, it loses. And if the guerrilla group does not lose, it wins. Therefore, the bottom line of this long analysis is the reaffirmation of an age-old truth. In colonial wars, if the natives do not let each other down, and if they don't give up, they eventually win. But if the natives win, what would that victory look like? Well, we started by saying that the causes of war are different from its triggers. And causes, as we all know, come in chains or trees of causality. The roots of such trees are always found in some form of injustice, inequality among equals. And it is that root of the problem that has to be addressed if peace is to be achieved. Therefore, and for a statement that I claim will continue to be relevant, Regardless of the military outcome of this episode of the Centennial War on Palestine, I would like to call back to the stage my friend Wadie Said, a statement that Wadie, myself, and Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sittah are working on. If the children win, this following statement shall be a constitution. If the F-16 wins, this shall be a banner under which to resume the struggle for equality by other means, like many of our brethren in South Africa, Asia, and even in North America. Wadie. We are going to read it together. The first line I'm going to read in English, and then one sentence that is mentioned in English I'm going to repeat in Arabic. Liberating Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea is possible and within this generation. تحريرها كلها ممكن.
The liberation of Palestine entails changing the regime that rules it today and doing away with Zionism, the racist political ideology that governs all of historic Palestine.
We seek to establish in its place a just system that does not award citizenship based on hereditary religion or discriminate based on race or creed. Rather, citizenship will be granted to the people of the land, to those born there or those who have a parent, grandparent, or documented ancestor born in the lands of historic Palestine. This would mean the return of the Palestinian refugees to their cities, villages, and the homes from which they have been displaced since 1948.
The result of this will be a Palestinian state in which all its citizens are equal before the law.
A system of transitional justice will be established whereby stolen lands will be returned to their owners or their heirs once they return. Anyone harmed by forced absence will be granted reparations. Loss and degradation of property will be compensated.
All those implicated in crimes of ethnic cleansing or genocide, whether they were giving orders or following them, will be brought to justice regardless of their religion or ethnic background.
With this declaration, we strive for a system of justice for all that ends bloodshed and a principle of equality that holds accountable each person for the crimes they have committed without regard to the passage of time.
This ensures that people will not be punished on the basis of religion or lineage or for what their parents did before them. What we strive for is neither amnesty for the criminal nor punishment for the innocent. We do not seek revenge or to collectively punish, but to replace an oppressive system with a just one, to replace racism with equality.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as we have here one of our great poets, I would ask Tamim to read one of his father's poems in conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. An excerpt from Tamim Barghouti's poem, Midnight, My Grandfather's Cloak. With a gentle hand, the storm grasps the handle of the door of the world. With a gentle hand, the storm grasps the handle of the door of the world. Like a hesitant stranger, it lets itself in, stripping off its masks, one after the other, dropping lightning into woods, darkness into torches, despair into ships, the devil into the horse's hooves, blueness into the lips of the carriage driver, and throwing me naked into the jaws of the night. The storm nearly wrenches loose the stag's horns. The muscles of the waves almost push back the coastline. The sea is a team of phosphorescent horses whipped by unseen lashes. They chomp the drizzle, the horizon and the stars, and carry on their flying hooves, the stench of sulfur. There are no boats on the sea. The harbor is a sheet of shattered porcelain. Nothing protects the trembling coast, not even the fur of the sea's foam. 2 chairs on the sand escape the storm as if they were 2 lame runners in a race. Even the most proficient of animal tamers cannot restore the unfettered waves to the God's control. I take refuge in that house with the imposing dome, merciful arches, warm blankets, and my grandfather's pictures, worn out at the edges in spite of the solidity of their mustaches. Pictures secure on the walls as if they were built into them. My grandfather, still harboring the illusion that the world is fine, fills his rustic pipe for the last time before the advent of the helmets and the bulldozers. My grandfather's cloak gets hooked on the bulldozer's teeth. The bulldozer retreats a few meters, empties its load, comes back to fill its huge shovel, and never has its fill. 20 times the bulldozer comes and goes. My grandfather's cloak still hooked on it. After the dust and smoke have cleared from the house that once stood there, and as I stare at the new emptiness, I see my grandfather wearing his cloak, wearing the very same cloak, not one similar to it, but the same one. He hugs me and maintains a silent gaze, as if his look could order the rubble to become a house, could restore the curtains to the windows, and my grandmother to her armchair, as if it could retrieve her colored medicine pills, could lay the sheets back on the bed, could hang the lights from the ceiling, and the pictures from the walls, as if his look could return the handles to the doors and the balconies to the stars, and persuade us to resume our dinner, as if the world had not collapsed, as if heaven had ears and eyes. He goes on staring at the emptiness. I say, what shall we do? What shall we do when the soldiers leave? What will he do when the soldiers leave? He slowly clenches his fist, recapturing a boxer's resolve in his right hand, his coarse bronze hand, the hand that tames the thorny slope, the hand that holds his hoe lightly and with ease, the hand which with a single blow splits a tree stump in half, the hand that opens in forgiveness, the hand that closes on the candy with which he surprises his grandchildren, the hand that was amputated many years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadie and Tamim, for a vision of what we shall do when the soldiers leave. And now, for our final speaker of the night. After Edward Said himself, the person we can thank for our gathering here tonight is Ahdaf Soueif, the founding chair of the Palestine Festival of Literature. Since PalFest was established in 2008, hundreds of writers have now experienced a part of Palestine for themselves, and so joined the ranks of politically committed artists and intellectuals, of which Said was such a paradigm. Like Said, her work is built on a deep cultural understanding of both the Arab world and the colonial West, and her fiction charts the history of the imperial encounter, while her non-fiction challenges it. So it is my very great honour to welcome to the stage Ahdaf Soueif.
Thank you, Aimee. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the previous speakers. I really feel that the last talk should have been the finale. So I feel a bit kind of like I'm going to be bringing everything down a bit, but who knows? I mean, this might have been an evening to go down in the annals with the announcement again was the announcement of one Palestinian state, or the actualization of the one-state solution. Who knows? I'm going to go back now to my talk and start again with, it's a great privilege to be here with you tonight, and in the company of my brilliant colleagues, to welcome the Fitzcarraldo publication of Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. Said's first full-length discourse on the issue, informing so much of the huge volume of work he has bequeathed to the world. The Question of Palestine makes for poignant reading today because while it recognizes and fully articulates the catastrophic situation of the Palestinians, the book in 1979 was still able to map out roads of hope. And all those roads are roads not taken. Edward Said died 20 years ago, yet he has not left us. We still turn to him, and as our world grows darker, we look to him for light. Some of us here, perhaps many of us, are lucky enough to count him as a personal friend. For many, including myself, he was both friend and mentor. Avi Shlaim made the joke about Edward Said's 3,000 close friends. He attributed to me, but I think, in fact, I was quoting someone else, but I've forgotten whom. But he was both friend and mentor, and we learned from him through example and advice. During this last terrible year, many people across the world, as Budour Hassan noted, have been speaking to and of him. What would Edward Said say to this, we ask? We examine what he said and wrote and did at various times, trying to pinpoint similarities and differences between what he lived and what we are living now, in order to work out what he would say, what he would advise us to do, what way forward he would point out. For Edward was brilliant at finding hope and mapping courses of action. At the last event we attended together, it was the Brighton Literary Festival in 2003. I commented on his relationship with the audience, and he said, if people ask, give them an action, give them something to do, and always hold out hope. What is the point of standing and talking if you don't do that? Over the last months, I must say, questioned hope and questioned even the value of action in the cultural sphere. And I have looked through Edward's work, his life, his interviews. And for us tonight, I've highlighted 4 elements that we might like to keep close by us. 1, Said's main and colossal work was in the cultural sphere, but he was also involved in directly political work. He was a member, as Wadie said, of the Palestine National Council from 1977 to 1991. He was well attuned to geopolitics and tried constantly and failed to steer Yasser Arafat in his dealings with the United States. And towards the end of his life, again, as Wadie said, he worked with Tamim Barghouti and Haider Abdel-Shafi to create the Palestine National Initiative, the Palestinian Third Way. The necessary partner to all this was that he came to the political work as an activist and an oppositional intellectual. Critical as he was of Israel and of American policy, he was equally critical of the PA and of the Arab leadership. I have always tried, he writes in the LRB in '93, grieving for Oslo, in an article called The Morning After, to be aware of our weaknesses and our failings as a people. I think it should be noted, though, also that he was very aware of the uses and misuses, of course, of text. And his most scathing and fierce criticisms of the Palestinian leadership and of the Arab leadership came out in Arabic, in Arab papers. So that was the audience, rather than be sort of exposing or acting as some kind of informant. In the last interview, as you saw the tape from Edward Said's last interview in 2003, he also advocates, again a political act, he advocates strongly that the Palestinians create a new national council. The second point is that Said always centered the people. Again and again, he makes it clear that it is their resistance, their resilience, which he describes as nothing short of miraculous, that keeps the cause alive as they hold on to Palestine tree by tree and stone by stone. The people have a right to narrate. The people have a right to determine. The people have a right to our attention. Palestine became a cause for him, he says, not because he was Palestinian, but because the cause is just. And I guess that happened to a lot of people. Jeanne expressed that very beautifully. And I guess that speaks for us, the non-Palestinians in this room, and for the millions across the world who are now so deeply invested in Palestine. It's no surprise that the line, Darwish's line, على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة, on this land there is that which deserves to live, has become Mahmoud Darwish's most popular quote. The third observation is that Said was always able to change course. The goal was always the same, a liberated Palestine, but the vehicle can change. Most noteworthy is his walking away from the two-state solution swamp to the far more endangering idea of one democratic state, which he admits in the last interview, again, as you saw, is, quote, utopian, but the alternative has been bloodletting on a scale no one can afford. And it is that bloodletting that has been taking place ever since. Always a humanist, Said repeats his belief that if it were set in place, if it were based on justice and equality, people, meaning Jewish Israelis, would have no problem living in it, in the one state. But here is a real question that needs to be asked. Were Said to witness today the videos and the TikToks posted by Israeli soldiers? Were he to hear the responses of the Israeli man in the street to interviews about the Gaza war and about what should happen to the Palestinians? Or the statements of the settlers, particularly the dead-eyed settler women? What life is it possible to imagine alongside them? I would have wanted to ask him that, and to actually get a hopeful answer. The fourth and last is the central issue of today, and this is Said describing it in 1992. This is a long quote, but it is really worth listening to. The main aspects of Palestinian life remain dispossession, exile, dispersion, disenfranchisement, and an extraordinarily widespread and stubborn resistance. Thousands of lives lost, and many more irreparably damaged, seem not to have diminished the spirit of resilience characterizing a national movement that, despite its many gains in achieving legitimacy, visibility, and enormous sustenance for its people against staggering odds, has not discovered a method for stopping or containing the relentless Israeli attempt to take over more and more Palestinian as well as Arab territory. The discrepancy between important political, moral, and cultural gains on the one hand, and on the other, a droning ground base of land alienation is at the heart of the Palestinian dilemma today. End of quote. Today, as Saree Makdisi pointed out, the moral and cultural gains, and perhaps the legal, have increased exponentially. Said always advocated reaching out to Americas other than the establishment. This was happening organically but slowly as young second and third generation American Arabs began to be politically active. The war on Gaza has grown it exponentially, with Palestine sitting at the intersection of race, colonialism, climate, and so on. It has also been hugely empowered by bodies like JVP and other Jewish groups. The marches, the sit-ins, the occupations are all things one wishes Said could have seen. They are how he believed the struggle would be won, and they would affirm his belief that it is natural for people to make common cause for a political and humanist good with no heed to race or nation. And of course, we all know that what these protests, what this awakening of the world to the Palestinian issue has done is that it has unmasked the basic undemocracy at the heart of Western democratic regimes, so that the Palestinian issue in the United States becomes an issue of freedom of speech, and similarly in this country. However, the essential dilemma remains: how do we transmute all this solidarity, all this energy, such as we have here tonight, into Palestinian land and trees and water and resources, secure from armies and from settlers? What are the actions that would link this movement in the moral world to movement in the practical one? Because really, us speaking here and you listening here tonight, it is, yes, an act of solidarity, but it is not an action in the world that will bring Palestinian liberation nearer. It can only be a prelude to that. It is hard in the urgency of the images streaming into our phones, the forests of outstretched arms holding out plastic containers, the piled up black bags, each containing 70 kilograms of body parts, the exhaustion on the faces. It is hard to think coherently, to strategize, to organize, and yet we must. We must work out how to enable the gains made in the moral and cultural sphere count in the political one on the ground. 1 year after Edward Said died, Palestinian civil society put out the call for a boycott. General boycott, but then a specific call for the cultural boycott, culture and academic boycott. Many artists, writers, and so on have observed the boycott silently. But now, 20 years later, that call has found resonance, and more than 7,000 book workers have signed up to it so far. I imagine that the action most immediately available to each one of us will be connected to the BDS call, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions call. And just to add here that actually when wondering about the usefulness or importance of work within the cultural sphere, it's quite reassuring to notice the Israeli reaction to it. It is that tells us how important it is. So when you think of, for example, the motion that was put forward in the Knesset by Meretz, that was, again, something that Edward spoke about, a proposal that Darwish would be taught in Israeli schools. That was just so roundly fought off. Or the boycott letter, in fact, that was published, and how the UK Lawyers for Israel, before the letter calling for boycott was even published, the lawyers had sent threats and so on. So basically, any glimpse of movement in the cultural sphere is met with tremendous antagonism by Israel, so it must be doing something. So the action immediately available to most of us will be in the region of BDS. There are partisans, of course, who for a while have not been content with this level of action and have put themselves in actual danger by trying to shut down Israeli weapons manufacturers in this country, such as El Beit. Absolutely, yeah. There are dockers who refuse to unload boats. There are women who arrest Israeli manufactured goods in supermarkets. Each one does what they can or what they can imagine. Edward Said's instruction is to propose action and to extend hope. I will end with two quotations which he was fond of. The first is from the American writer Grace Paley, "The only recognizable feature of hope is action. And the final one, is from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. If the end of days comes upon you, and in your hands you hold a young shoot, plant it in the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahdaf, and thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you also to you, the audience, for filling this enormous hall. The question of Palestine can be answered. Its answer requires the end of imperialism, the end of colonial relations, the end of Britain and America's unquestioning support for genocide. And if Edward Said teaches us anything, it is that culture has a direct role to play, and that is constantly being reimagined and reconstructed. We have so many lessons to take away with us tonight, so many ideas. But as Ahdaf has just said, it is not enough. None of us are doing enough. So let us not tire as we all work together for a truly free world, and at its heart, a free Palestine.